Welcome back, everybody, to the companion podcast for podcasting for small business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. I'm Ray Sidney-Smith, and I'm joined here with my co-host and co-author, Steve Orr. How's it going, Steve?
Ray, as always, I'm raring to go, just waiting for you to, you know, wave that flag at the Indianapolis 500, or what do you need to do? Whatever
Yeah,
it
is
is.
that a checkered flag or
Checkered flag, yes.
is it the checkered flag? Okay, I,
Mm,
I can never tell whether it's a different flag at the beginning than from the end.
I don't know.
But either way, we're gonna get the checkered flag waving here for you, Steve, because I'm sure you are very excited to talk about today's episode, which is all about being a good podcast guest, but also being good to your podcast guests. And so it's a little bit about how we make sure the conversation stays alive and well throughout the course of recording a podcast. And so, whether you're the one being interviewed or the one asking the questions, each podcast appearance you make is really a chance to make sure that you are doing some skills development while you're also growing your business's brand. And so, the success of it all requires more than just showing up on the mic, right? It requires a strategy. And so today we're going to be talking about some of those issues, narrowing your message. And Steve's going to talk about some of those pieces about how to do that. We're going to talk about some of the homework you need to do before the show. And then, of course, some tips for getting some guests who are going to make sure that you as a business look great. Okay. So let's get started. Let's talk about the setup here. Steve, what do people need to know about entering the podcast world?
Wh- to me, one of the most important things is to think of this as an opportunity to share your passion, your knowledge, whatever it is, rather than looking at it as a nuisance to be a guest on a podcast. I know a lot of business owners may think, "Oh, I don't have the time. I just can't fit it into my incredibly busy schedule." To that, we say, and I think we're both in agreement, is no, this is a great opportunity for you to grow your business, but just in a different way.
Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I can't imagine any business owner today that doesn't that shouldn't want to be on a podcast. I mean, unless you're going on a podcast that is completely not related to you or your business, the opportunity to be able to talk about your business on a podcast really is like taking away 80 to 90% of the work of producing a podcast. And so there is a real value to being regularly interviewed. And I didn't recognize this. I will, mea culpa, I didn't recognize this up front in my early days of podcasting. And I turned down hundreds, it must be, of podcast interviews over the years because I didn't quite get that until it came to a point maybe about 7 8 years ago when I started recognizing, wait a second, I'm going to go on someone's podcast, they're going to do all of the work of editing to make me sound great, and they're going to do all the SEO, they're going to publish the episode, they're going to they're going to promote it. Why wouldn't I want to be on someone else's podcast? And so this is the value of being a guest on a podcast, is that you can actually get prepared, show up, be your best self, talk about your brand, talk about your products and services, and people want to hear about it. They want to hear about your expertise and your specialization and the value you bring, and you don't have to do all the work.
It's well, you do have to do some work to be a
Yes, yes,
great
not
to be
all
a
the work.
great guest. Yes, but you're
Yeah,
not doing all the work. But
all
it
the work.
seems like a no-brainer to me, Ray. It's really wrong that you didn't know me back then, Ray, because I would have hit you over the head and say, "What the heck are you thinking?" This
Yeah,
is a
but
free opportunity for you to promote your business or to, share your knowledge, your passion, whatever it is. Just makes sense. And not only that, it gives you an opportunity to become a better speaker. I think I joked in a past episode, maybe when we were talking about being the host, the joke about how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. The more you are as a guest on a show, the better your skills are going to be as a public speaker.
oh,
Simple as
totally.
that.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. The idea here is that we want to be able to kind of it's kind of like being employed before you become self-employed, right? You want to make mistakes on somebody else's time and dime, and this gives you that opportunity to kind of play in the field, get used to who you are on the microphone, figure out your skills deficits, and then work to fix those, right? And that means finding someone like Steve who can help you with your media appearances and media presentation, but also just being able to hone the skills in some way, shape, or form and be open to listening back to that podcast episode. And what I like to do is I actually ask for the raw audio from when I am interviewed, because I will frequently want to listen back to, you know what, could I have just done it better so that they didn't have to do so much work in post? And also, it gives me an opportunity to kind of hear the way in which I organized my thoughts in that process. And after doing that probably a dozen or so times, it really helped me understand where I might go, awry in terms of talking for too long before kind of segueing to someone else. Because many times, if you're a podcast host and like myself, I'm a podcast host. I have lots of thoughts that I want to share, but I also need to shut up at some point because the guest is the one who's supposed to be on supposed to be in the spotlight or in the limelight, so to speak. And so you have to navigate in your head as a host how much you talk versus how much you shut up and listen. And the other side to it is that when you're the guest, though, you're supposed to talk. Really, I feel like it's one of those things, you talk until the host tells you to shut up, right? They give you that signal. But at the same time, there are natural points where you kind of want to set the host up for the next segment or set the host up for the next question, and you should be mindful of that as well. Because if you're recording in a closed environment, it doesn't matter. They're going to clean it up. They're going to take out the bits they don't like, and leave the bits in that make you sound good. So this gives you that opportunity to kind of do that. But if you listen back to a raw episode, you get a lot more feel of like, okay, that was the right way to say that. They may have used the wrong clip that you wanted, fine, whatever. But now you know the language you want to use in future interviews and recordings.
And that goes with your preparation, making sure that you're going to say what you want to say in the way that you want to say it. But I wanted to get back to one thing that you said, and, talking about a guest going on until the host says, okay, shut up. I look at it as one who works with clients that go on podcasts and guest on podcasts, and I try to beat it into their heads. This is not a monologue. This is a focused conversation. See, there is a train of thought that when you go as a guest, that you are giving a monologue interrupted by questions. And I say, think about it a little bit differently and think about it as a focused conversation. Just that mindset will hopefully protect against you just droning on and on and on and on until eventually the host says, shut up.
Right. But I don't,
So we have a
again,
different mindset in how you as a guest should be your best self on a podcast, clearly.
yeah, and I think that, again, I don't think I'm disagreeing with you here. I don't think you should be just droning on and on. If you're ever droning, I reach through the podcast microphone and give you a little hit on the noggin there. But no, the goal is for you to be able to, if you're excited about a topic and you are telling folks about that topic, I don't think you should stop. I would disagree with Steve, minus the droning piece. Like when you're excited about something, you want to capture that moment. You want to capture the excitement. And unless the podcast host is like, this is completely far afield or this is not no longer useful, whatever, they'll tell you. And if you're in a recording, it's fine because you can have that kind of stop and go in the recording. I actually enjoy I think it's Mel Robbins that sometimes takes some of the outtakes at the end of her podcast. And it's just kind of funny to hear some of those outtakes. And you won't get that if you're not passionate about what you're talking about in the first place, but you're also not talking, right? If you give, 3-word or 3-sentence answers to every question, it's gonna sound staid. It's not gonna sound fluid. Conversations are not metered, you know, conversations. Sometimes one person talks a little bit more than the other person. Sometimes another person at one point in the segment, in one segment, you may talk more than the other person. In another segment, that person may talk more. Conversations are organic that way. And if you have those ebbs and flows, that's what I mean by don't stop talking. Go on
Okay.
until
Okay.
until the host tells you to stop if you're passionate about that subject and you really want to get those things out, because then you get the material that the host needs to then do it in post. So I think we're pretty much on the same page there. It's just having I think that more people have a problem with talking than with not talking. And so they will like clam up on the mic instead of expressing themselves, being their full selves. And when you want to bring your full authentic self to the microphone, you're going to be a better guest. And I think that's really important.
So I don't disagree with any of that. And see, I'm finding with a lot of folks that I work with, they have the exact opposite problem in that they want to get into the weeds. They're so passionate about what they're talking about that then you go down roads that your listeners may not care about, nor the host. And then that ends up providing more work for the host in the end because of what they need to do to edit out the stuff that really doesn't matter.
Well, that's why those folks are coming to you because they just need to stay on topic. I
And
mean,
it can
if
be
you
hard. I mean, honestly, I work with a lot of authors. I think I've mentioned that before. They're brilliant. They have a lot to say, but you don't want to say all of it on a podcast, not just because you might have a tendency to go 5 minutes to answer one question, but because you also want to tease your book and you don't want to go in depth in your book because then why are people going to want to buy your book? So think of it from that perspective. Hey, we're talking about our book here on this companion podcast. We are not delving deeply into every little bit of minutia in the book, and that's deliberate because we want people, we want them to hear what we have to say, but at the same time, we don't want them to have the whole book with this podcast. Let's be
Also, it
honest
wouldn't be
about it.
helpful. Yeah, it wouldn't be
No,
helpful
no,
if it were just us dialoguing about all of
no.
the topics in the book. That's what an audiobook is for, which maybe will come out at some point in the future. But the goal here for folks is to be given an opportunity to hear our thoughts behind the podcast, some of our suggestions and recommendations and thoughts that help to kind of underscore the podcast, the book about podcasting, and to help you be a better podcaster through our dialogue. And again, as we just witnessed, there are places where Steve and I are not going to agree on things, and that really helps you because it helps you make an informed decision about things that are not necessarily set in stone. So much of podcasting, so much of content creation is not set in stone. You have so many opportunities to do things when you narrow it down to the business perspective. I'm not talking about a book author as Steve is talking about. You're a business owner, or you may have authored a book, but I don't care about that piece. I care about you producing a podcast about your business. And when you're a guest on a podcast or you're hosting guests on a podcast, it's really important for you to have that kind of laser mindset with regard to what's the content I need to put out a really good business podcast. And when you're doing that, then you need to make sure that you are not always cutting off guests, because it's really easy to go into your podcast editing software, into your editing software, and just highlight and delete. It's not easy to go find that podcast guest later and say, you know what, you started going into this topic and I cut you off, and now I need you to go back and record more about that because we really need that, right? It's just not going to happen. And so really start to think through that. Good minds can disagree about these issues. Only one of them is probably right.
Well, that's been the case with you, Ray, the whole process here. We won't go into all the deep discussions we've had about those issues, and even the issue of should we be providing information for you as a business owner, as a guest on a show? I know we had discussions about that as well. Just should we include some of this information in this book to help business owners? Because ideally, it can be useful to think of yourself as a guest and not just a host.
Right, right. And I think there's we can kind of go into this now, which is that being a good host to a guest is is going to be most of what you do in most small business podcasts. Most business podcasts tend to be a guest and potentially a co-host with guests, and typically it's a solo host and a solo guest. Doesn't always have to be, but that's really the format that I most see today. I'd like to see a little bit more variety in that sense, but you do what is going to work best for your business, what's going to be the best workflow, what's going to get the right content out the door. And so as a podcast host, I always think of it very similar to, I kind of analogize it to bringing a guest into your home. And you greet them at the door, you send an invitation, right? You want to send them an invitation, you want to make sure they know where they're going, giving them guidelines in terms of what's the attire, what's going to be eaten there, do they have any allergies, food allergies, all of those kinds of things that a guest, a good host would give to a guest before showing up to your home. You kind of want to have that checklist, and we provide you one in the resources library that folks can use, so that folks know, hey, okay, this is what my expectations are showing up to a recording, and then you kind of help them through the process of being in the recording and then post recording as well. So there is this before, during, and after piece that we discuss in the book, so folks know this is not just about, you know here goes a calendar invitation, and show up to the calendar invitation, and that's it. You don't want anyone to walk in blind. They're not going to show up and be their best selves. You got to do a little bit of work there as a host.
So I know that you believe very strongly that there are a few very specific things that you want to, as a host, give your guests ahead of an appearance. Can you get into that a little bit, and without going too deep, but give me like your top 3 or top 5 that really, when you're seeking guests, what you need to do?
Yeah, so I think that the primary thing that I always try to have folks know about are really the technological piece of it. Because this is a business, we frequently need to make sure that we are paying attention to the kind of legalities of it. We don't want to get too crazed about these things, but we want to really make sure that their technology is in place. We want to make sure that they have the kind of a release of some kind, that they don't have to sign a document, right? By virtue of, I'm not your lawyer, this is not legal advice, but you need to make sure that by them showing up on the podcast, they have consented to basically participating in the recording. And so just having a very simple brief statement that you've emailed to them, or that you've sent along to them in a guest guidelines document like we recommend in the book, you have basically said, hey, we're going to take your voice and your likeness and we're going to use it. Remember, voice and likeness, because it's not just voice anymore, right? You're recording video, and you're taking potentially caricatures, like the caricature we've got here on screen of Steve and I, right? Well, you might take that into a chat GPT or Google Gemini or something like that, and create an image. You might modify it in some way, shape, or form. And that you're putting that on not only in the podcast, but also in many other materials around it. And so just making sure that you're kind of giving them those pieces, obviously giving them some kind of program, episode agenda, give them the ability to understand what they're walking into. And then, of course, there's like the logistic stuff, right? I always think that we should do some logistic stuff, and that might include confirmation, so they show up on time. Just like any other appointment, if you get the reminders, notifications, and so on and so forth, you're much more likely to show up to those things. And people are busy, they get distracted, all of those kinds of things. And so you want to make sure that you do kind of that. Some podcasts like to do like a pre-show chat, and I know that I do, and I always talk about this, and I probably have already said it at some point, but I like the idea of having you show up uh, maybe 5 or 10 minutes before recording, and just start the recording as soon as they show up. So that little red light or whatever showing up on the recording then starts to bleed into the background. The nerves of being recorded kind of go away. And then once you get into the conversation, they're just all of those, hormones that kind of kick into your system have kind of subsided, and now they can bring really, again, I always talk about bringing your best self, bringing that your best self to the mic. Like that's something, Steve.
I everything you said, I completely agree with. I will say, however, that there are some challenges, both as you as a guest that you need to think about, but also as a host inviting guests. And why don't we take the piece that you were just talking about and take the flip side of that? What are some of the challenges that you see hosts having when they're inviting guests on their show?
Yeah, so I think that one is scheduling. Scheduling can be a huge problem, and so we don't even tackle that in the book because essential blueprint. I mean, if we started getting into all of that, we'd be talking for days. And this is what we're here for. We could talk about this for a few minutes, but just logistics of getting people on the mic together in the same space and time. Right, you have to decide whether or not you're going to do recordings like Steve and I. We're in two different cities in the United States, and we're recording uh, simultaneously, right? We're synchronously recording, but we are in two disparate locations. So we're utilizing, technology in order to be able to bring this together. And obviously, we're recording in front of you all live that are watching the live recording, but we're also recording this for primarily the podcast afterward. And so we're doing this in that regard. Some people are going to want to bring people into the room, right, into the same physical space, which of course is going to create more complexity in the logistics because now that person needs to make sure they've brushed their teeth and done a little bit of mouthwash, right? You don't want to be sitting across from someone with bad breath. But these are things that you need to tell folks, right? Because sometimes they just don't know. They don't recognize. This is something that I'm sure actors deal with all the time, right? You meet you're going to be up close and personal with actors. Maybe you're going to be kissing them on screen. Well, you don't want to be kissing someone who has like stuff going on there, right? So you want to make sure that they've taken a shower that day. They've put on their cologne. Those kinds of things. And those are things that in-person recordings needs to be, I think, almost explicitly said up front to just be like, hey, these are things that I do, their recommendations for you to do. And also, then if we're going to do this by a virtual circumstance like Steve and I, we meet ahead of time to make sure that microphones are working, that video's working, that the setup is working, and so on and so forth. And you have to satisfy sometimes. Maybe like myself, I feel like I'm always crooked on these video because I have a bunch of webcams set up, and I've got to kind of fiddle with them to make me feel right. And you're not always going to be in the best mood. You're not always going to have the best hair day, and which is why I like audio podcasts.
So do I, as one who lacks quite a bit of hair. I agree with you.
You look great, Steve. You look
Yeah.
great. But the goal here is to think through these logistics ahead of time because as a podcast host, all of these kinds of problems creep up on you if you haven't thought them through ahead of time. So that's number one is like those in-person logistics, getting on the calendar. I think having a calendar scheduling tool where guests can look at their own calendar and then look at your calendar in real time and schedule in them saves a lot of time and effort. Some people use an assistant for being able to do those things, but most often than not, it's just really much easier to use technology, especially if things need to be rescheduled. Many of those calendar scheduling tools have just an automatic rescheduling function, so they can be rescheduled to a later date where you control the rescheduling process, but you're being given a little bit more flexibility or giving a little bit more flexibility to the guest in that regard. Because if you have a stomach ache that day or you're just feeling nerves, you may want to move it to a later date when you're going to feel better about those things, especially say during flu and cold season and now COVID season, I suppose. We are consistently in this state where winter months may mean you're going to have more guests punt because they are not feeling well, and that has happened with me. I'll go schedule a whole bunch of folks in the fall, and then all of a sudden everybody moves around because everyone's getting sick, and so then all of a sudden someone that you had planned to record 2 weeks from now for an episode that's going to come out 4 weeks from now, all of a sudden you have days from the recording to publication. So be very mindful that you want to really set those recording pieces way in advance. Not too much in advance, because remember, you want to kind of be timely about the topic. You don't want a big political or news event to be so far in the back mirror in the future, so far in the future that when you record the episode, there may have been mention of something like that that's going to cause a brand public relations nightmare for you. And then the other piece that I really find is this, we're going to kind of go segue into our second segment here, Steve, with regard to under preparation. Many times, folks just think they know it all, and so they show up to the microphone thinking that they do. Case in point, Steve and I spent several years, more than several years, writing this book. And at the same time, it's imperative for Steve and I both to review the book and the chapter we're talking about every time we come to the mic, because if I don't read this chapter, I've read hundreds of pages of other things, both client material, my own other writing, my own other things that I'm reviewing on a day to day basis. Those are all clouding my thoughts regarding that. So to show up for today's podcast, I had to read the chapter again and then read Steve's preparation of the program agenda, do my own writing because I want to get my own thoughts out there so that as we're making our way through, I have my own thoughts. And that's the preparation that's necessary. So when we show up today and Steve and I are talking, I could be like, you know what? Steve wanted to cover that thing, but I wanted to cover this thing. Right. And so we're gonna be able to do that. And Steve may cut me off and say, hey, I want to talk about that thing also. That's perfect. That's great. That's what we're here for.
So yes, and in talking about, segging into, kind of our second segment of sorts, in talking about some of the challenges on my end when I work with folks, I mentioned a lot of folks tend to talk too much. So that is a very common challenge. Another challenge that I find with folks as guests and sometimes as hosts, relying on jargon. And that can be especially troublesome if you're an expert in one particular field of your business. You're invited onto a podcast, which is not necessarily tied to your industry, but like as a more general topic, they want you on as a guest. And you're using language that is specific to your industry. How does that help your audience? So it is crucial that you consider the language that you're using during your guest appearances. And let me give you an example of a client I was working with a few years ago who, again, I work with a lot of authors, but I think it's apropos here. This particular author wrote a book about data, the misinformation of data that we are bombarded with every day. In describing this particular data, he said, okay, and I'm not sure I'm going to get the number correctly here, but roughly we're bombarded with about 12 gigabytes of misinformation of data every day. Now, if you're listening to that and you're not, a techie, what does that mean to you? And I'll ask you, Ray, thinking in your non-tech, I mean, can you visualize this? Can you see this? What would this mean to you if you are not a tech person?
Yeah, it would be too abstract. It would be too abstract.
My point exactly. So that is a challenge that folks have. So when we worked together, what I said was, well, how do we paint that picture? How do we make this something that people can understand, that people can see, they can feel, whatever it is? It's roughly, again, I don't remember the exact number, but about 10 dump trucks of paper that we're bombarded with every day. You can visualize that. You can see that. Whereas if you just say, it's 12 gigabytes of data, it doesn't mean the same thing as being able to visualize it and see it or feel it or how it might impact your wallet. Think in terms of you're a guest, think in terms of the language that you use that can get that out to help your audience experience this with you. So that is a challenge that I find affects a lot of people. They're also worried that they're going to lose their spontaneity if they over prepare. There is no such thing as, to me anyway, there is no such thing as over preparing. And to
Yeah.
me, if you are to prepare as much as you can, when your host asks you a question, You are so much better prepared to answer that question. To me, that's more spontaneous and authentic than if you have to search for your words and you're going, let me think. Oh God, I really thought it, perhaps I had that somewhere, but it's not readily available to you because you have not done that preparation.
Right. My understanding, by the way, just so people know, is more than half of the information you see online is either false or inaccurate. So I don't know what the exact data amount is. I mean, every person has a different data appetite every day.
Sure.
But so if more than half of what you read every day is false or inaccurate, whether that be misinformation, disinformation, or otherwise, you need to be very mindful of how you curate that. But what Steve is talking about is that that abstraction can be taken to that would be like if you read a book a day and every time you read the book 50 to 60% of the book was wrong. you know so being able to relate it to an analogy that is what we call skeuomorphic, right, that feels like it's part of the real world, is so many times a better angle than going and trying to use kind of obscure metrics or quantifying in a way. I mean, humans don't, I don't know this is necessarily true, but humans don't count from birth, right? Numeracy is not something that we naturally have as a skill. We're taught to count. We're taught to be able to do those things. Although there is some science that says that humans naturally have an ability to count, but we're not like doing algebra, from birth. We have to be taught that kind of, the basics of math in that sense. And so we're just not naturally inclined toward that. So, and that's just one example of abstractions. I think jargon comes into play in a number of different regards when we talk about being a host and being a guest. So I think I fully agree with Steve. If you're a guest on a podcast and you start using jargon that people will not understand on the podcast for the podcast audience that is listening, that's a real problem. Flip that to the side of the podcast host. If you're a podcast host, it's really important that you, one, let a guest know about any jargon that you are going to be using on your podcast. So, for example, I always recommend podcast hosts to create cult language. And what do I mean by that? Cult
What do you mean
language.
by that? What do you mean, Ray?
Yeah, so we all use types of cult language in our everyday lives. That's why you go to different brands and love those brands, because people assume a sense of familiarity with that brand. And the same thing happens in language. And so we want to be able to create that in an audio environment so that we create that parasocial relationship. We're not trying to do it for wrong reasons. We're doing this for the right reasons, which is to bring someone closer to the problem solution dynamic. And so someone has a felt need or want, we're trying to provide that solution for them through our products and services. The podcast is a mechanism for them becoming aware and building a relationship with you to that solution. So the goal here is that cult language, right? Like cults, have a leader typically. That leader will create certain names, like a demonym. Like basically, these are my cult followers. They'll have like their own name, right? And they'll have certain things that they call activities or artifacts within the cult itself. We do that by nature. We just automatically do that in our everyday lives regarding all kinds of things. And so when it comes to the podcast, there may be jargon that you do use that is of a particular nature. And you want to make sure your guest is not taken off guard by that. So you just want to make sure that they know that kind of jargon that you are going to be using, any terminology that has become, say, an inside joke for you and your ongoing listeners. And again, going back to that point we made a few episodes ago about, hey, you might want to like redefine it every few episodes, because there's going to be somebody who's new to the podcast. You hope you have new people coming to the podcast who's not going to know that language, not going to know that jargon. And so you may even want to have a page on your website where you kind of define those things as well. So I don't think there's a problem with using jargon. You just have to make sure that you're defining it at the right points and places. Make sure your guest knows you're going to be using those terms, and just make sure you understand that some of those terms may be misinterpreted when they're spoken to the wrong audiences. So make sure you're using them in front of the right audiences. Like if you decide that jerks are the name of your podcast listeners, You know, understand that's not going to be taken well by someone who doesn't listen to the podcast on a regular basis and has adopted the cult language, right? If I showed up on a podcast and every time someone said like, oh yeah, only jerks listen to this podcast, I'm gonna be like, well, I don't want to be on this podcast. I don't want to deal with a bunch of jerks. And then it's like, no, 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 it's an acronym. It's for something, blah blah blah, and like everybody loves it, and like they go out and they do kind acts, and they're called jerks, and it's a fun, kind of opposites thing. Fine, okay, you got to explain that, because it's just going to be way too much for that person anyway.
Yeah, so you mentioned something I wanted to add, and that is acronyms. Same situation as jargon. If you're using an acronym, if you have to use that acronym, make sure you explain it. Simple as that. And I wanted to get to another point, which we kind of touched on in terms of challenges, and that is under preparation. So there are a couple of different ways you can be underprepared as a guest. It's your preparation for knowing your industry, knowing your business, making sure that you do all that necessary work, making sure that you're aware of what's going on in your industry, in the grander scheme of the news, in case you're asked a question about that in this, whatever the podcast is that you may be guesting on. So that's one part of the preparation. The other part of the preparation is just knowing simple things like, are you going to be taped? Where are you going to be taped? Yeah, what equipment do you need? Well, we would always say have headphones and a microphone, but making sure that you know things like that. Understanding who your host is. Perhaps you need to listen to some episodes of the host that you're going to be appearing on that podcast. Get a better sense of, perhaps how they ask questions. So pay attention to how they ask questions and the topics that they go on, and they may have similar topics during their run of their podcast, things like that. So that's the second part of preparation that you really need to be aware of. You do those two things, and you're off to a much better start than most people would be who don't do that.
I would underscore what you said about listening to a podcast host's work before you get onto a podcast as a guest. It is really important that you know who's interviewing you. I would never go on a podcast if unless I know the person, which I have been like the first guest of people's podcasts before, and that's fine because I knew them beforehand.
Mhm.
But if I didn't know that person and was invited to be a guest on their podcast, I would absolutely have to listen to at least a few of their episodes, hopefully most current episodes, so that I knew who this person was. Because if I don't agree with their values, right, they may be pro big business, right? They're all about big business, and as all of you know, I'm pro small business, and so if they're going to attack me for being pro small business, I want to be prepared. I don't mind. I don't mind a healthy, thoughtful debate on this. I will win that debate, and and
You don't
but
lack for confidence, that is for sure.
no, not at all. Or facts. I know the facts behind this, and uh, and so and so I would come to the table very differently than if I didn't listen and then showed up, and then all of a sudden now I'm left, kind of without preparation for that kind of circumstance. Also, the very nature of the person interviewing is really good to get their personality. If they're kind of a dogged interviewer, someone who's really assertive, bulldog kind of
Mhm.
gotcha questions and so on and so forth, you may read the questions beforehand. That doesn't mean that they're the questions they're going to ask, nor does that mean that's the way they're going to ask them. So you want to really hear them take care of prior guests. So you can say, oh, you know what? This is they're totally chill, or they're really bulldogs. So I've got to come in with a little bit more assertiveness to push back on perhaps a question that might be asked in a particular color, that will take me off guard and make me answer it perhaps the wrong way for me and for my business reasons for being on the podcast. So we want to listen to them beforehand for not just the getting to know them and what they typically say, but how they say it and what kind of person they are. Because they may have values that you don't agree with, and that's not bad. I think it's a healthy thing to have and disagree. Obviously, Steve and I love to banter about our disagreements, but I think it's really healthy, and I wouldn't do this if I didn't respect Steve, and so the goal is to recognize where you're going to have conflict and make it healthy, because I
Oh,
think that also makes for really great podcasts too. Healthy conflict is really good. It's drama, but in the right way.
and it can be, and we may not have gone into this in previous episodes, but it can be the same kind of research that you need to do if you are the host and thinking about who your guest is. Now you need to do the research of reading, what they've written, if they've written stuff, if they've appeared on other podcasts, to get a sense of who they are. So think about it from the flip side if you are the host and interviewing somebody who's going to be your guest. And there's one other challenge that I want to get into very briefly that people have, and that is the pacing when they're guesting. Same can be with the host, knowing when to pause, knowing when to raise your voice, maybe perhaps whispering because you're about to say something so important. You want people to lean in. And then the biggest thing has happened in the universe for this episode, things like that. But no, in term being more seriously, but knowing some folks have a tendency to speak too fast when they are nervous, or perhaps they're speaking. We talk about this a little bit in the book about speaking, breathing from your diaphragm or your belly rather than breathing through your nose or your neck or whatever, and that can affect the tone of your voice. So things like that can be challenges and can affect, how natural you sound. And the more you practice that, and again, you mentioned about listening back to podcasts as you're a guest, things like that can help you get better over time. And the more you practice that, same with, getting back to one thing we said earlier about over talking, the more in, we used to do what we called a podcast air check, which I do for clients as well, just which covers a variety of different topics. But one of them is, the amount of talking that you're doing. How can you say that better? Because chances are, if you go on a podcast, you may be asked a similar question. So the more you listen back, the more you listen to how you sound, whether it's tone, pacing, um, all those kinds of issues. The more you listen back, the better you're going to get, and the more you practice it, the better you're going to get, is what I mean to say.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is really great about utilizing AI today in podcasting, and we'll talk a little bit about this more in chapter 11 when we get there, but you can practice these interviews beforehand utilizing live or voice mode in these AI chatbots. So you can provide all the questions uh, to the chatbot beforehand and say, "Ask me these questions one by one, and I want you to critique how I answer them, or ask me these questions in a tougher tone or in a tougher way, so that you throw me off guard." And now what you can do is you can go ahead and listen back to your answers. You can have the criticism being given to you through the AI chatbots, and that can be really helpful so that you can say, "Oh, you know what? I spoke about this in a way that, when heard back, is not how I want to present that topic." And you can kind of hone that so that when you do show up to the actual recording, you've already said all of this before, and that gives you an opportunity to. And different for me, there's really never a podcast I'm going on where I haven't already said what I'm going to say already somewhere else. It's for me. I've already done so much of the underlying research for what I'm talking about. These are typically things that I feel well versed in. So it's not going to be a concern for me. I may riff, I may go off a little bit on something, but I always know the navigating thread that I'm coming back to. If you don't have that sense, then you absolutely need to practice, before you show up to a recording, because you're just going to mumble a lot, not mumble, but you're going to go in all kinds of divergent thinking that's not necessary when you show up to the recording. I wanted to make just a quick note here about the whole concept of performance pressures that Steve was talking about. And uh, generally, when you are either a host or a guest and you're on the mic, you are typically not monitoring your own voice, as Steve and I are. We are capable of doing. I currently have an ear infection, so I'm not doing that right now. But the idea here is that, when you're hearing your own voice in the system, you're a little more conscious and also perhaps anxious about what your voice sounds like. And when you're recording a podcast as a guest, you're not gonna have a monitor in, so you're not gonna hear your own voice. You're going to hear the podcast host or hosts and potentially other guests, but you're not really hearing your own voice. And so this could be helpful or not helpful. You need to decide for yourself what's going to be best. I I don't mind hearing my voice today. Snap back 15 years ago, and I hated hearing my own voice. I would record episodes and just loathe to edit them because it was my voice that I had to edit. And so you will tolerate it more and more the more you hear it. And I think over time, like with Steve's work with his clients, I'm sure because they become better diaphragmatic breathing and speaking with more resonance, you get better at speaking, and therefore your voice changes on the mic, and therefore you feel better about it. So just know that's going to happen. You're going to be like, oh, I hate my voice. And everybody does it to some extent, unless there's some, narcissists out there who are like, I always love my voice. Good for you. Good for
Yeah,
you.
yes, I was gonna say good for you, but no, and one other part of that which I wanted to say is vary your pitch can also help you. You don't wanna sound monotone, and I know people worry about that, but that can also be related to the passion that you have. If you have an incredibly important point that you wanna make, chances are you are gonna sound much more animated. Now, I'm not saying that has to be everything you say, because otherwise you're not gonna be monotone, you're gonna be 8 miles high. So don't necessarily be 8 miles high with your energy level, but when it comes to those important points, consider varying your pitch and your pacing. Give people a chance to catch up to what you're saying by taking a breath in between major points. That's another quick little tip. One other real quick little tip that I can give you, if you are about to say something that you feel is very important, you can flag it, what we call flagging. You could say, this is key. Take a beat and then give your key point. That way, you alert your listeners that something big is going to happen and you give them a chance to catch up to what you're about to say.
I've done it twice here in this episode where I said, this is something I want to underscore from what Steve
Mhm.
said.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then I went into it because I knew that Steve said it in his words. I'm now gonna say it in my own words, and I'm adding a little bit more to it because, I have a different perspective maybe or otherwise. But just saying something like, "This is key, this is really important," making that pause, taking that breath, and then going into it. I like the term underscore, I like the term, key. I like to say this is gonna be really important for you to listen to and then go into it. So
Mhm.
absolutely. I wanted to also note for folks who who have a host. This is going to get me in so much trouble. I have been on I've been on many podcasts, so this is not any one particular person, but I've been on hosts where my energy, I just have probably a little bit more energy than others, and that host is maybe a little boring, and so you have to try and kind of um, not only figure out how to navigate matching energy, right? Like if you have a like a spastic host who's like very excited and over dramatic, and you seem meek or just kind of bored, or just monotone even, not bored, but monotone. It's that difference in energy is going to be felt by the listener. And you want to really be mindful of that. At the same time, if you come hot out the gate and your podcast host is very staid and, low and, whatever, that's also going to be kind of weird for the listener. So you have to kind of mediate the how much energy you bring while still being yourself. Right? You really do want to be yourself, and you want to be your peppiest self. I know that a podcast is a form of performance, right? We want as much authenticity, but the authenticity you would bring in front of a group of folks. And at the same time, recognizing that you're having a one-to-one conversation, not only with the person who's potentially interviewing you, but the person who's listening. And so you have this kind of weird duality of being observed while you're having a conversation, while you're navigating the reality that this conversation is going to be heard by many people over and over and over again. And so we prepare, like Steve and I, we prepare to do this in front of a live audience so that there's less editing. Really,
Yeah,
that's the reason.
hopefully. Hopefully.
I'm not editing anything. So we're just going live with it, Steve. But then this also brings that personality that you have in front of an audience. So there's a little bit of that. There's of course the fact that I want to be able to have a conversation with Steve. I mean, I enjoy. I'm not sure about Steve, but I enjoy talking with Steve. And there's always we get to talk about our personal lives, we get to talk about work, we get to talk about the book and podcasting news that's happening, and so we get to cover all of those things. And so there's this one-to-one engagement, but also then there's you're listening. And so you need to be mindful of the fact that there's someone who's going to hear this afterward, and you need to be representing your business and your brand and your own personal and professional reputation at the same time. So there's all of these dualities that I think is really important, not just the tone and tempo and all the prosody that comes along with being behind the mic. It's all of these other kind of polishes that and I don't want to get people overwhelmed, but be mindful of the dynamics that are going on. All right, this brings us right along to our kind of final segment here, and talking through some of the more practical elements of really being able to jump on the mic for guesting or hosting. Steve, where do you want to go with kind of this topic?
So let's talk a little bit about, we've covered a lot of this in many ways, but let's just talk about, you as the guest, and in terms of you being prepared and being ready and not losing your authenticity or your spontaneity. In the book, we talk about three different ways to be a great guest. The first is focus. And, we've talked about that, thinking about your audience. What we haven't talked about in terms of, making sure you're not saying too much and losing the audience in too many weeds and the like. I like to say when I work with folks, think about your three major points, think about them as your headlines, and you kind of weave those in throughout your guest appearance. And then, in order to support those three headlines, I have what I call highlights, and think of those in terms of your supporting data, whether it's an anecdote, whether it's a survey, data, whatever it is, to kind of support those major points. And if you're doing that, you're not overwhelming your audience, and you're helping them retain the information after they listen to the podcast. That is your goal as a guest, is to have your audience, give them information they can use and information that they can remember. And that's key. The second part of it is the preparation part, which we've kind of talked about. The preparation that you need to do for both yourself and for who you're the podcast host that you're going to be interviewed by, understanding who they are and understanding your needs. So that is part of your preparation. Anticipating questions is another part of your preparation. Be aware of that. The final part is, the practice. If you have the opportunity, do as many mock interviews as you can so you get more comfortable with the information. Also, what I mentioned a little bit earlier, where we talked about, varying your pitch, your pacing, things like that. That is all part of the practice part of this. And that will only help you be, under the overarching term, more prepared for your podcast appearance.
Yeah, I think that there is a point where I think that Steve would say that you can't be over prepared. I think that there is a point where we can get kind of tongue tied by virtue of things. And what I like about Steve's thought about just having kind of headlines and a few bullet points, this helps you uh, break it down into a structure that filters out the noise from the signal. And so you're only talking about the signal and not the noise. And I would say that there are different circumstances where having these things written out in front of you, so having a printed sheet with your kind of headlines, and what Steve is talking about is like a news headline, right? Like having something like that where you have a headline for an article or blog post or that kind of thing written out, and then the data points that support that particular headline. And what you want to be able to do is to be able to really have those roll off your tongue. They should be things that you feel comfortable with saying over and over and over again. And if you're not comfortable with saying them, then you need to have that in some way, shape, or form written out for you to be able to kind of glance at and know that you're going to get the numbers correct, that you're going to be able to say it fluidly, those kinds of things. Now, again, if you were in a particular environment, you may not feel comfortable having that paper out. Maybe the host doesn't want they want it to be more feel authentic, so they don't want you to have papers or those kinds of things out. So there's a little bit of navigating those social issues with the host and the environment. But I like having, I always have my notes open and ready and available to me. And you can't see them because mostly my podcasts are audio. But even if you're watching on the live video, you can't see them. They're on my screen. I can look at them. I can glance and make sure that what I'm saying is flowing and those kinds of things. So just make sure you know how you're going to be set up to be able to best have those things available to you. You may have just a tablet or an iPad. I have a Kindle Scribe where I keep my notes so that I don't get distracted. It can't make any noises, and it also has a stylus, so I can make little notes. So it's a little bit of a note taking system for me as well. So I like having that kind of dumbed down tablet experience in front of me. I also like the Kindle Scribe because it has a portfolio. I call it a padfolio, which allows you to tent the tablet so it's up at an angle, but not so it's not flat on the table. It's up at an angle so I can see it. I can glance at it, but it's not too invasive. So just know what you're going to need technologically to show up physically, and know that you have your notes, you have your materials in front of you, that you can say these things fluidly. But don't try to know everything going into the podcast, because if you try that, you're just going to overwhelm yourself. And I would consider that over preparation if you're going
Yeah,
to
and that
overwhelm yourself to the point of not being able to talk.
absolutely. And again, to underscore what you were saying about what I was saying, and you're referring back to what I was saying in that, rather than having 20 different messages that you want to bring to the table during a podcast appearance, have about three. Weave them into more than once. Again, you will reinforces the information for your audience, helping them better retain the information that you want to give them. Think about it like this. How much of it you hear a top 10 list and you only hear it once? How much of that top 10 list do you remember? You're not going to remember all 10, I'm guessing. Maybe you, Ray, because you're extra special. But for us normal folks, seriously, but how much of that do you remember? You hear it once and there's 10 things. How much of that would you remember?
Yeah, you have to be mindful that you're not going to. And the goal here is for you to actually not tell a podcast audience everything all at once,
Mhm,
because you want to tease them, also want to tease the host to want to have you back. Right? If you're
mhm.
a really great guest and you get in front of their audience once, then what's better than getting in front of their audience twice, right? It's double the SEO. It's going to be better for you in terms of reaching them multiple times. You get multiple touch points, and you're building a relationship with that podcast host. And that means that podcast host is going to refer you to other podcasters, right? Because we know each other, right? As soon as you start podcasting, you're going to meet other podcasts, that podcast hosts like you, and they're going to say, "Hey, I heard you had so and so on the podcast. I'd love to interview them. Also, can you make the referral?" Sure, happy to introduce people for those reasons. So, if you tell them everything in that first episode, one, you're going to only be able to go very superficial, on any of those items, and you're going to not give you're just going to give it all away. And so you're going to do a worse job with all of it kind of jam packed into that one episode. So really bound your topic to the things you really want to get across in that one episode. And think of it just like a blog post, right? A blog post is not going to cover everything you could ever tell anybody about anything, right? It's something that you can explain to somebody in 3 to 5 minutes, and in a summary perspective, and then there's a conversation, right? And you can explain all the other things underlying the 3 to 5 minutes of conversation in that longer form perspective, and you'll get a sense of it, right? Don't I mean, I know this is for many of you listening, this is the start of your journey. And so we're telling you a lot of things that you will learn through both attrition, but also through just absorption, through osmosis of doing this. And we're trying to give this to you up front so you don't make some of these mistakes. But don't worry so much about these things as much. Just be mindful that they're things that you should be thinking about as you're making your way through becoming more expert at both hosting guests and being a guest on the podcast. Steve, any final bullet points, topic things that you want to talk about before we start wrapping up this episode?
So think about it like this. Great podcast conversations, they're built with intention. We didn't really talk much about being intentional. That's another thing I say to my clients a lot. Be intentional about what you say. And you know what happens when you focus on your messages, you prepare thoughtfully, and you practice, you eventually, and no doubt, you will create a better and more meaningful conversation. And that's truly what you want, a more meaningful conversation. So that's that piece when it comes to being a guest. And when it comes to giving your guests guidelines, streamline that experience as much as you can so that will help your guests be prepared and that they can shine.
Absolutely, Steve. So thank you for that little summation. And this brings us really to the end of this episode of our companion podcast for podcasting for small business. Next week, we're going to dive into chapter 7, which is our getting equipped chapter, and talking about equipment and just like the equipment you need versus the equipment you want. And we're going to have a special guest with us next week. So stay tuned for that. If you are certainly listening to the live version of this, we have a special guest joining us next week. And so with that, I'm Ray Sidney-Smith, joined by Steve Orr for Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. Take care, everybody.